Last year, one of my most anticipated point-and-click adventure games of 2019 was Artifex Mundi's adventure game they developed and published in May of that year. That game was Irony Curtain, from Matryoshka with Love. It's a very Russian/Soviet themed adventure taking place during a fictional Cold War in 1951. Similar to the Cold War from our history where capitalist and communist superpowers were at odds, although not at war, trying to outdo and spy each other. The communist superpower and dictatorship in question in this case being the state of Matryoshka, the game's equivalent to former Soviet Russia, separated from the rest of the capitalist world by the Iron Curtain. As the title may have given it away, this is supposed to be a satirical and comical adventure making fun of the Soviet Union and communism in general. And considering how Artifex Mundi is a Polish game developer and publisher, and since Poland used to be a satellite state under the Union, you would think they know one or two things about communism and what living under Soviet rule was like until the Union collapsed in 1991. But how good is the game itself? My name is Siperos and these are my thoughts on Irony Curtain, from Matryoshka with Love. The protagonist of the story is Evan Kowalski. Not Ivan, Evan. A young journalist and what I like to call as a champagne socialist, advocating the beautiful thing that is communism, while living comfortably in a totally normal middle-class family in the States, never having been in Matryoshka. But don't worry, he has read a lot about Matryoshka, mostly fake propaganda, so he totally knows what the country is like. One day Evan gets an invitation to a TV talk show where he tells the pro-capitalist public about communism and why they should embrace it. As you can imagine, it doesn't go very well for him. During the broadcast, however, he is spotted by a Matryoshkan spy named Anna Iglov, who approaches Evan, telling him how Matryoshkan authorities were impressed by his work and invites Evan to the country. He is also told that the great supreme leader of Matryoshka, who is basically a mockery of Stalin, is in danger and that Iglov needs Evan's help to save his life. Naturally, being a big fan of the great leader and having always wanting to visit Matryoshka, Evan says yes and, with Iglov, manages to get out of the States and into Matryoshka to uncover the conspiracy against the leader. Let's start with the graphics this time, since that's always the first thing that catches a player's eye and was the first reason that made me interested in Irony Curtain. The second reason being the fact that it is a satire about communism. But anyway, this is the type of cartoony art style that I like the most in adventure games. That's why The Curse of Monkey Island, Toonstruck and Gippes, a Cthulhu adventure, are some of my most favorite adventures. It's colorful, and yet manages to have somewhat depressing ambience in some scenes, reflecting the sad reality and hopelessness of the oppressed inhabitants of the capital. It has a lot of character, and the 2D cartoon animation is very smooth. I also like these close-up look windows. Kinda like comic book panels. Again, gives a lot of character. The only thing that put me off a little at the start was Evan himself, who, unlike the rest of the characters and environments, is 3D, except in cutscenes. At first it was a little distracting to me, but over time I got used to it and, looking back, despite being 3D, Evan blends in well with the rest of the game, because he still has that cartoony look to him. I guess the reason why they made him 3D and not 2D like everyone and everything else is because it was a lot cheaper and easier to animate a 3D model than make unique 2D animations for his each action in the game. I could be wrong on that, but that's my speculation. Speaking about Evan, let's go to characters next, starting, as always, from the game's protagonist, Evan Kowalski, who looks like someone you would get as a result if Guybrush Threepwood and Conan O'Brien were fused together into a cartoon character, voiced by Christopher Rackland.
My name is Evan Kowalski, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Daily Worker Monthly. By the way, I highly recommend buying a subscription.
Evan is well educated, clever, innocent, has a positive attitude and funny lines.
Einstein recently said that he doesn't know what weapons will be used in the Third World War, but the Fourth will be fought with sticks and stones. I suppose he means that we'll probably be out of bullets after the Third War. I'm sure we can make some more, though.
And is overall very likable and polite. But he is also naive, ignorant, and even lives in denial for a while when in Matryoshka, trying to understand, or rather justify, why things are as they are in the country, having trouble to accept what communism and life under such a regime is really like, after consuming so much false Matryoshkan propaganda for years in the comfort of his own home in the States.
I feel sorry for them, but how did they get here anyways? I guess communism guarantees the end of homelessness. Ha! What a nice perk.
Overall, I do like Evan as the protagonist, and he does grow a little as a character when his eyes are open at the end. Unfortunately, there is not much that I can say about the rest of the characters in the game, because none of them are interesting or memorable. We do have some conversations with the spy, Anna Eaglove, voiced by Kelly Burke.
I'll explain in a minute, but first, tell me everything that happened after we met. I need to know where we stand.
And learn what she's all about and where her true loyalties lie. The leader, the main villain of the game, voiced by Carrie Shale.
Major Orwova, how's your vacation at Uncle Sam?
Doesn't do much in the game and spends most of his time on a phone. Which is perhaps the most disappointing thing in the game in my opinion, because I wanted this mini Stalin to do something and give us a reason to despise him, besides the fact that he is a communist dictator. They could have made him both cruel but funny at the same time. At the endgame there was this one gag of him being on a phone, of course, telling the person on the other end to arrest and execute people who were close to this enemy of his, and also the second antagonist of the game, and he just kept going on and on in the background, going through family members to friends, neighbors, neighbors' families and friends, and so on. He was so horrible and evil that he was funny to me. I wished we had seen more of that. And yet the leader does next to nothing in the game. And yes, the game has a second antagonist, whom I won't talk about much because that would go to spoiler territory. But he had a slightly bigger role in the game, though not by much. First working in the shadows behind the scenes and revealing himself around the last third of the game. Both he and the leader bring big twists of their own to the story at the end, but honestly, they were rather predictable, felt unnecessary, even pointless, and made me go like, yeah, sure, I don't really care though. Overall, I feel like the villains didn't do much in the game or give me a good reason to hate or even dislike them outside of the fact that they are the bad guys of the story. As for the rest of the characters in the game, they are just there to give you the items you need and basically be miserable, demonstrating why communism is a bad system, how much they hate to live under their leader's regime and want to see change. That's really their only reason to exist. Kinda reminds me of Lisa Suit Larry, where characters are also there to just give you the items so that you are one step closer to your goal and the plot can move on. So unfortunately you won't meet many interesting characters. Mostly just stereotypical Russians under Soviet-like regime, just trying to get by. The only one who had the potential to have bigger role in the story and become someone I actually cared about was Sergeant... Medvedev? Yeah, him. Voiced by Andrew Wincott. But he's unfortunately just tossed aside once he had done his part. In my opinion, Irony Curtain's biggest weakness is its characters who, maybe outside of Evan, are just not interesting and you ultimately don't care about. Even the villains, sadly. You could argue that's because the game is supposed to be a satire of communism and the former Soviet Union, and thus the characters, outside of the protagonist, are not as important and they are just there to make fun of the system. But I think they could have still done more with the villains and maybe some other side characters as well to make a more compelling story. What is the best thing about Irony Curtain from Matryoshka with Love then? That would be the puzzles. Irony Curtain is one of the more challenging adventure games that I have played recently, and in my opinion, it hits the sweet spot in puzzle design. They are not too easy or too hard, just perfect, at least for me. They are not always obvious, some of them are even clever and creative, and those puzzles are always the most fun ones to me. Like the one where we had to collect various items to make a fake uniform disguise to infiltrate into a military base. That was a fun one. I also like the puzzles you had to solve to break out of prison. You pick up and carry multiple, about 10 to 15 items at max at a time. Some of them that can be combined, or has interactive parts of their own, like buttons for example. Just good old school adventure game goodness which I dig. There's also a hotspot highlight feature in case you have trouble finding items or stuff to interact with. So gameplay wise, Irony Curtain doesn't really offer anything new to the genre. But hey, why try to be innovative just for the sake of it if something old and familiar has always worked and still does today, right? And if you still think the puzzles are too hard, don't worry, because the game has its own hint system. Basically everywhere you go, there's always a hint phone somewhere you can use to call an operative who can help you out with some puzzles without ever giving the straight up solution. So you always must connect the dots and solve them yourself. It's a very well added feature which you can of course ignore if you want to figure out everything by yourself. I admit, I relied on it a few times. So the puzzles are excellent, wacky and much fun. What's also fun is the game's sense of humor.
And do not worry, your ass will be here when your luggage arrives. I really shouldn't do this, but... Here, You can have a quick look at this ass.
Oh, a pass. It's
Yeah.
a pass. Of course it's a pass.
Yeah, of course.
I'm so glad it's a pass.
As you might expect, the game is having fun at Communism's expense in a witty and charming way, although the game gets a little more serious by the end, but not too much. I think the game is the funniest when it revels in its own absurdity and satire with oblivious Evan in the middle of it all. The dialogue and voice acting are also great.
Oh, so he can more easily distribute it equally amongst the citizens?
Yes, of course. It's pretty clear that the writers took notes from LucasArts adventure games, like the Monkey Island games and Day of the Tentacle for example, and were heavily influenced by them. The last criticism that I have about Irony Curtain is that, in my opinion, it only half nails the satire part of the game. Yes, they make funny jokes at the expense of communism and the leader, but they don't really go deep into the subject matter and demonstrate why it's terrible. They just go with the assumption that the player also thinks communism is a failed system and knows why. And I don't necessarily blame them for that, but at the same time I think they could have educated the player by explaining how communism/socialism quote-unquote worked in practice. Why use coupons instead of money? Why is there so big inflation that money is almost worthless? Well, that kinda answered the first question. How did the redistribution work? Why are food and other goods so scarce? Why is there apparently always a dictator in these types of regimes and no democracy? And so on. The satirical nature of the story requires at least a basic understanding how communism works to ensure that the jokes make sense. If you want to make a satire of something a little more complicated such as communism, you should also demonstrate how it works, or is supposed to work in theory, and then make fun of its flaws. Irony Curtain, from Matryoshka with Love, is a charming and fun satirical old-school adventure game. While the characters didn't leave a strong impression on me, even Evan is very much just like Guybrush, and I found them as just non-interesting stereotypes, and Artifex Mundi could have done the overall satire part way better. I do think the positives outweigh the negatives here. The story may be your basic uncover and expose a conspiracy plot, with a couple twists that didn't really surprise me and felt pointless, but I think that, just like with The Curse of Monkey Island for example, it's the journey and comedy throughout it that is the most important, especially to a game that is supposed to be a satire. The puzzles are fun and creative and, at least for me, perfect when it comes to difficulty. The cartoony hand-painted 2D art style beautifully captures the environments, characters, and the sense of both humor and bleakness. The jokes worked for me, voice acting is top-notch, and the hint phone is a nice feature for those who need a little more help with the puzzles without having to go search for a walkthrough online if they get stuck. So I can recommend this to both casual and more experienced adventurers. If you like the puzzle design, writing and humor of LucasArts adventure games, you are going to like this satirical adventure. So, there you go folks. Those were my thoughts on Irony Curtain, from Matryoshka with Love. What are your thoughts on the game? Let me know in the comments and thanks for watching.